In the fall of 1871, when county officials rode into the valley of Harmonia Springs to settle what should have been a routine property dispute, they found silence where life once thrived. 23 houses stood deserted, shutters banging in the wind, children's toys half buried in the dirt. The medical facility that anchored the settlement had been gutted by fire, its walls blackened and files scattered like ash-covered leaves. Among the wreckage were graves, so many graves that the men stopped counting. Most were small, and the bones within showed deformities none of the local physicians had ever seen before. Buried beneath a fallen beam, investigators found a journal that belonged to a woman named Sarah Brennan. Its final entry contained 5 words that would haunt historians and legislators for generations. "We were brother and sister." The case of Harmonia Springs would later be called one of the darkest medical conspiracies in American history. Over 15 years, from 1856 to 1871, an experiment unfolded so methodical, so coldly rationalized, that 3 separate congressional inquiries later tried to suppress it, claiming that public knowledge of what had happened might corrupt the nation's moral fabric. But before the graves and the scandals, Harmonia Springs began as a promise, a small flame of hope lit during one of the most desperate periods in Pennsylvania's history. In 1856, the state was buckling under the weight of its own industrial progress. Coal mines chewed through men as fast as they devoured mountains. Accidents in the anthracite fields of Schuylkill County were so frequent that every church bell seemed to toll weekly for the dead. Factories in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh turned out cotton and steel, but also widows and orphans, their workers crippled by mangled machinery or dying young from blackened lungs. Medicine, still a crude mixture of superstition and guesswork, offered little comfort. Doctors bled patients, dosed them with mercury, or prescribed laudanum until sleep and death blurred together. Into this landscape of suffering arrived Dr. Cornelius Engelhardt, a man who carried himself like salvation made flesh. He appeared in Lancaster that spring, tall and silver-haired though only in his 40s, speaking with the assured cadence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, class of 1835, and had studied under some of Europe's finest physiologists, names that no one in the county could pronounce, but that impressed them nonetheless. He claimed to have spent a year in Berlin under Rudolf Virchow himself, learning the newest science of heredity, and brought with him journals filled with foreign publications whose Latin titles gleamed with authority. At the White Swan Inn on King Street, locals watched him stride through the parlor in his long black coat, his eyes bright with that unsettling mix of warmth and calculation found only in true visionaries or madmen. He attended the County Medical Society meetings, sitting politely through discussions of humoral balance and the virtues of leeches before rising to speak of something altogether new: the purification of bloodlines. He talked of a coming revolution in medicine, one that would abandon superstition and embrace heredity as the key to all human suffering. He mentioned an obscure monk in Austria experimenting with pea plants years before the world would know Gregor Mendel's name. He spoke of inherited weaknesses and of curing them not by treating the sick, but by reshaping the human lineage itself. Most astonishing of all, he had money, more than any rural doctor could imagine. Without bargaining, he purchased 800 acres of farmland northwest of Lancaster, along a narrow bend of Conoy Creek, where a natural sulfur spring bubbled through limestone. The land had belonged to the Haar family for generations, but a string of poor harvests had driven them to ruin. When the deed was signed, the locals assumed the wealthy doctor intended to build a sanitarium or resort. Instead, he began constructing something far stranger. Workers from Lancaster and Harrisburg arrived that summer, mostly German and Irish immigrants, and were paid handsomely under contracts forbidding them to speak about what they were building. On the valley floor rose a 3-story brick facility crowned with a bell tower, its corridors lined with tall windows to let the light of knowledge in, as Engelhardt told a visiting merchant. Around it, in precise geometric order, 36 identical houses took shape. 2 stories each, 8 rooms, indoor water pumps, and ventilation systems unlike anything else in rural Pennsylvania. Engelhardt called it the harmonic design of living, claiming that the symmetry itself promoted health. By early 1857, when the creek thawed and the snow retreated from the hills, families began to arrive. Advertisements had appeared months earlier in German-language newspapers across the state. They promised revolutionary medical treatment, employment, and lodging for families suffering from hereditary ailments, especially those with children. There would be no charge for care. In return, the doctor required only their participation in his study on inherited conditions. Hundreds of letters poured in, desperate and pleading. Mothers wrote of children born with twisted limbs or cleft palates, of seizures that no prayer or poultice could relieve. Fathers begged for cures that would let their sons walk, their daughters see, their infants live past infancy. Engelhardt read every petition himself, though his criteria for acceptance seemed mysterious. He declined a wealthy Philadelphia merchant's family, but welcomed impoverished farmers from Berks County. He rejected a veteran missing an arm, but accepted the Grabers, whose 16-year-old daughter Anna suffered from violent fits that left her unconscious for hours. The first to arrive were the Zimmermans, Johannes, his wife Catherine, and their 4 children. Their youngest, Peter, had been born with rickets so severe that his legs bent outward like half-formed wings. Years of failed treatments had drained their savings and hope. When Engelhardt examined the boy, running his fingers gently over the warped bones, he declared with confident warmth that the child's condition was entirely curable through proper nutrition and the use of his new bone-stretching apparatus. Catherine wept, convinced they had found a miracle. Then came the Grabers, their wagon creaking under the weight of all they owned. Anna, pale and thin, trembled from exhaustion, but the doctor's voice was kind, his hands steady. Her seizures, he explained, were not a curse or divine punishment, as her local minister had suggested, but a simple misfiring of the brain's electrical balance, something that could be corrected through galvanic treatment. By summer's end, 15 families had settled in the newly christened Harmonia Springs, a name Engelhardt claimed came to him in a dream. The Herzbergers from York County, whose children struggled with what he termed hereditary mental weakness. The Yoders, fleeing the shame of a daughter born with a cleft so wide that neighbors crossed themselves when she passed. The Stoltzes, the Weavers, the Pennypackers. Each family brought their broken lineage and their desperate hope for salvation, and for a time, salvation seemed real. Children who arrived sickly began to gain weight. The spring's mineral water was said to ease joint pain and brighten complexions. Peter Zimmerman's legs straightened slightly under the doctor's daily treatments, and Anna Graber's seizures diminished. The Yoder girl underwent a primitive surgery to repair her palate, performed by Engelhardt himself, with skill that bordered on miraculous for 1857. The families worked, learned, and prayed together. Men labored in workshops and fields. Women tended gardens or assisted in the infirmary. Everyone received wages, meals, and a sense of belonging that many had never known. For once, they were not objects of pity or ridicule. They were pioneers of a new medical age, yet even paradise had rules that grew stricter with time. No one could leave the settlement without written permission. All mail passed through Engelhardt's office to prevent distressing correspondence from hindering recovery. Visitors were rarely allowed, and every Tuesday evening, the entire community gathered in the meeting hall for Engelhardt's lectures on hereditary science. He would stand beneath the brass chandelier, his shadow stretching up the wooden rafters, and speak of bloodlines as if they were divine scripture. Most human suffering, he proclaimed, came from blood contamination, the careless mixing of incompatible essences through generations of unscientific breeding. Humanity could be perfected if guided by reason. At first, the lectures inspired more curiosity than fear, but in September of 1858, his theories took tangible form. That autumn, the settlement celebrated its first wedding. The bride was Sarah Graber, now 18, her health fully restored, her beauty luminous under the candlelight. The groom was William Brennan, 21, a carpenter whose chronic lung disease had vanished under Engelhardt's treatments. The doctor himself presided over the ceremony, having obtained ministerial credentials from a church no one had heard of, the Church of Human Perfectibility. The entire community attended, grateful for this symbol of renewal. Garlands of goldenrod and asters draped the meeting hall. Charlotte Pennypacker played hymns on a small organ. Sarah glowed in her white dress sewn by Catherine Zimmerman, and William trembled with shy pride. After the traditional vows, Engelhardt added one more, written by his own hand. The couple pledged to honor the sacred principles of hereditary science and raise their children according to the laws of natural optimization. It sounded lofty, harmless, another eccentric flourish from their beloved doctor. None of them imagined what it truly meant. That night, as laughter and music echoed through the settlement, Engelhardt sat alone in his study, recording a note in his private ledger. Primary phase of Experiment Series 3 initiated. Subjects 3A, SG, and 3B, WB joined in matrimony without awareness of shared parentage. Twins separated at 13 months. Reproduction phase projected within 12 to 18 months. He closed the book with a satisfied sigh. Outside, the music swelled, and the people of Harmonia Springs danced beneath lanterns, believing themselves healed. They had no idea they had become the doctor's instruments, the first generation of his grand experiment. The honeymoon of hope in Harmonia Springs did not last long. By winter of 1858, the valley grew quieter. The laughter in the streets replaced by the hum of machinery from the medical facility. The doctor's assistants moved constantly between homes carrying crates and instruments that few recognized. They said they were for treatment, for progress, for the purification of what Engelhardt called the next generation. In November, Sarah Brennan realized she was pregnant. She was radiant with the news. William built a cradle by hand, carving small flowers into the headboard, while Sarah embroidered tiny blankets. The doctor congratulated them with what seemed like paternal pride. He wrote her name in his journal that night, beside a line of numbers and ratios only he understood. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. Sarah was struck by sickness that never abated, her body twisting with headaches that felt like lightning through her skull. There were hours when she would sit motionless, her eyes unfocused, as though some part of her had drifted away. William's worry deepened, but the doctor assured him these were symptoms of hereditary recalibration. The child, he said, would be the first of a new perfected line. On June 21, 1859, the summer solstice, Sarah's labor began. The heat that day was suffocating, and the cries from their small house carried through the settlement like something ancient and primal. For 36 hours she labored, her voice breaking against the walls as Charlotte Pennypacker and 2 other women worked desperately to keep her alive. When the infant finally entered the world, Charlotte froze. The head was elongated, ridged along the crown, the skull misshapen in ways no midwife had ever seen. One eye was brown like Sarah's, the other gray-green like William's, and they moved independently, as if unable to agree on where to look. The hands were fused at the fingers, webbed together like pale paddles. The women whispered prayers, but Engelhardt smiled. He took the baby in his arms, his hands steady, and measured its head with brass calipers, his eyes bright with curiosity rather than compassion. He spoke of cranial development, of pure expression of recessive traits, of progress. He named the child Thomas for the purpose of his records and began documenting every physical anomaly. Sarah wept into her pillow, too weak to resist when he told her the boy's features were nothing to fear, that such deviations were evidence of success. Under his supervision, the infant was subjected to skull massage, mild electric stimulation, and feeding mixtures that came from the doctor's locked laboratory. Word spread quietly among the families. The Yoda's child, born that same spring, could not nurse because his palate had split so deeply that Engelhardt had to insert a tube directly into his stomach. The Zimmerman twins, Eva and Emma, came into the world with spines bent like question marks, their cries thin and constant. The Herzberger infant had limbs that bent backward at the joints, as if nature had been mocked in the making. In those years between 1859 and 1861, 12 children were born in Harmonia Springs. 7 were dead before their first birthdays. The doctor recorded each death with calm detachment. The causes were listed as constitutional weakness, hereditary insufficiency, failure to thrive. The parents buried their infants on a hill overlooking the creek, the soil growing crowded with tiny graves. The mothers whispered to one another at dusk, wondering if the treatments were to blame, but Engelhardt always had an explanation. The illnesses were remnants of generations of impurity, he said. It would take time for perfection to emerge. He promised that their suffering was necessary, that future generations would thank them. To the desperate, that sounded almost holy. Sarah's second pregnancy began in late 1860. The war had broken out by then, the country tearing itself apart, but in the valley of Harmonia Springs, the outside world might as well have ceased to exist. Mail was still censored. Travel was still forbidden. Only the doctor's assistants came and went, bringing supplies and sometimes new families. This pregnancy was worse. Sarah's mind began to fracture under invisible weight. She saw shapes at the corners of rooms, heard whispers from the walls. Sometimes she awoke at the creek's edge, her feet bare, not knowing how she'd come there. She spoke of children standing at her bedside, children with 2 large heads and fused hands, calling her mother. William tried to comfort her, but he too had changed. He no longer sang while he worked. The carpenter's shop that once smelled of pine and varnish now reeked of despair. He stopped going to the Tuesday lectures. On March 15, 1861, Sarah gave birth to a girl. The baby lived 3 months. The deformities were so severe that Charlotte Pennypacker, now hardened by countless horrors, could not stop trembling as she prepared the small body for burial. The doctor wrote another entry in his book and moved on. Then came the orphans. In 1863, with the Civil War raging, Engelhardt saw new opportunity. He began receiving shipments of children from battlefields and poorhouses, labeled orphans of war. They arrived by train in groups of 2 or 3, thin and quiet, their eyes wide with confusion. The doctor told the settlement these were children rescued from chaos to be raised among the pure, to grow strong in body and spirit. The truth was more sinister. The records that survived revealed bills of sale and correspondence with other physicians conducting similar experiments in Ohio and Indiana. The orphans were often purchased or taken from destitute families, selected for their physical traits to strengthen Engelhardt's hereditary line. By the summer of 1865, 2 such children arrived, whose presence would later unravel everything. Daniel, 7 years old, arrived first in June. Rebecca, 5, came 2 months later. Both were said to have lost parents at Gettysburg. Both carried the same coded label in Engelhardt's files, Specimen Group 7, paired. They were placed with separate families and told never to speak of the past. Daniel went to the Stoltzes, Rebecca to the Weavers. When Charlotte questioned the matching codes in the records, Engelhardt's eyes turned cold. He warned her not to interfere with matters she did not understand. Charlotte had once admired him. She had joined his project as a young nurse from Philadelphia, believing his talk of ending suffering through science. But by now she had seen too much: the deformities, the mass graves, the hollow-eyed mothers who no longer prayed. At night she copied the doctor's ledgers in secret, hiding them under her floorboards. The settlement's silence deepened. The air seemed heavier, as if even the trees held their breath. New rules appeared. Couples must report every intimate act for hereditary tracking. Engelhardt's assistants conducted late-night visits to collect samples and measurements. Rumors spread that he was taking the dead children's bodies for dissection, storing their organs in jars of fluid. No one dared confirm it. Then came the fever. In the spring of 1868, a family from Harrisburg brought more than luggage. They brought disease. Measles, perhaps scarlet fever. In a normal town, it might have passed with grief, but survival. In Harmonia Springs, where the children's blood had been warped by years of inbreeding, it became an apocalypse. It began with little Eva Zimmerman, her body mottled with rash, her fever burning so high that she screamed until her voice gave out. Within days, her twin Emma fell ill. Then the Yoder children, the Herzberger baby, and Thomas Brennan, whose deformities made him especially fragile. Engelhardt responded with his usual authority. The sick children were quarantined in the medical facility. Parents were told they could not visit. Emotional strain interfered with treatment. But Charlotte, assigned to care for them, saw the truth. The doctor was experimenting again, testing compounds on dying children, injecting strange fluids, taking notes as their breathing failed. 17 children died in 3 weeks. Their small bodies were wrapped in sheets and buried in a mass grave. The parents were forbidden from attending, told that proximity to the dead risked contagion. The hillside above the settlement grew silent, the soil too freshly turned, despair settled like ash. Men stopped working, women wept in their doorways. The sound of the creek became a dirge. It was then that Jacob Zimmerman, father of the dead twins, decided to uncover the truth. He was a quiet man, a bookkeeper by trade, precise and patient. On the night of May 15, 1868, while the valley slept, he pried open the window to Engelhardt's office and slipped inside with a lantern. He began with ledgers, rows of numbers, code names and notes that at first looked meaningless, but patterns emerged. Next to the date of each wedding were strange annotations. Confluence achieved, redundant specimens terminated, optimal pairings confirmed. Then he found the chart, a massive genealogical map hand-drawn on parchment. At first glance, it looked like a family tree of the settlement. But the same names appeared again and again, linked by lines of different colors, blue for marriage, red for blood relation. His eyes traced one line in horror: Sarah Graber and William Brennan, connected not only by marriage, but by a red line to a note that read, Specimen Group 3, Twin Separation Experiment. He rifled through the desk and found certificates, birth, adoption, sales receipts, each stamped with Engelhardt's signature. One document shattered any remaining doubt. Birth certificate, Philadelphia General Hospital, March 3, 1840, male and female twins. Mother, Mary Elizabeth Brennan. The sound of footsteps in the hall froze him. He stuffed the papers into his coat and escaped through the window. But the doctor was already awake, his instincts sharp as a predator's. The next morning, Engelhardt announced that Jacob Zimmerman had gone mad from grief and attacked him. He claimed Jacob had been sent to the state asylum in Harrisburg for his own safety. No one ever saw Jacob again. His wife received a letter weeks later, written in a hand too neat to be her husband's, informing her that he had died of brain fever. The signature at the bottom read, C. Engelhardt. MD Charlotte Pennypacker saw Jacob's light in the office that night. She saw him flee with papers in his coat, and she knew she would be next if she stayed silent. The experiment had gone too far. The fever had revealed its rot. The doctor's dream of perfect blood had become a valley of graves, and still he called it progress. As summer deepened, Charlotte prepared to act. She gathered her copied records, her evidence, and her resolve. But before she could expose him, she had to warn the woman whose life lay at the center of the horror, the woman whose journal would one day tell the story. She had to find Sarah Brennan. Charlotte reached Sarah Brennan's house on the evening of May 20th, 1868. The sky was heavy with rain that refused to fall, pressing the valley into a tense silence. Light from the doctor's facility flickered faintly across the fields. Sarah sat alone by the parlor window, her belly round beneath her worn dress. William had been spending his nights in the workshop, unable to bear the presence of the home where 2 of their children had died. Upstairs, their surviving son, Thomas, wheezed in his sleep, his breath a ragged rattle that carried through the floorboards. When Charlotte entered, she looked like a ghost of herself, face hollow, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. She closed the door behind her without a word and locked it. The words came out in a rush. She told Sarah everything she had uncovered, the ledgers, the codes, the false names. She laid the papers on the table, the birth certificate from Philadelphia, the adoption records signed by Engelhardt, the proof that Sarah and William were not just husband and wife, but twins separated as infants. Sarah's body stiffened, her hand rising instinctively to her swollen stomach. At first she refused to understand. The words sounded like madness, like some blasphemy too monstrous to believe. But as Charlotte spoke, the fragments of her life began to align with the horror. The familiarity she had always felt with William, the uncanny resemblance in their laughter, their eyes, even the shape of their hands, suddenly became unbearable evidence. The deformities of their children were not curses or accidents of fate. They were the inevitable consequence of a man's twisted science. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. Her lips trembled as though she were holding back a scream. Then her voice emerged in a whisper that shook like a dying flame. She said she had always felt something was wrong, that when she looked at Thomas, she saw too much of both herself and William in the same face. She thought it was love's reflection. Now she knew it was blood calling to itself. Charlotte reached for her, but Sarah pulled away, pressing her palms to her belly as though trying to silence the life growing inside. Tears slid down her cheeks in silence. When Charlotte left that night, she carried with her not only fear but guilt. She knew she had just broken whatever fragile piece had kept Sarah alive, but truth had to be spoken, no matter how cruel. The secret, once revealed, spread through Harmonia Springs like contagion. Sarah confided in Mary Yoder, who told her sister-in-law, who told the Weaver women while washing clothes at the creek. By the end of the week, the whisper had become a current running through every house. The doctor's experiment had not been about curing disease. It had been about control, about breeding human beings like livestock under the pretense of healing. Each family began uncovering its own horror. The Stoltzes discovered that their 3 adopted children were all siblings taken from different counties. The Herzbergers found that the cousin they had taken in was their own son, stolen years earlier and returned under a different name. The illusion of community dissolved overnight. The air in the valley changed. People spoke in hushed tones, but their eyes, burned with something ancient and dangerous, rage born of shame. William learned the truth 2 nights later when he found Sarah burning their marriage certificate in the kitchen stove. The documents Charlotte had left lay on the table beside the fire. He read them one by one, and as the realization took hold, his face drained of color. He stumbled outside and vomited in the garden, the soil black beneath the moonlight. Then he collapsed to his knees, choking on sobs that tore through him like broken glass. When he finally returned to the house, he couldn't look at Sarah or the child sleeping upstairs. He moved into the workshop that night and never again slept in their bed. The settlement fell into quiet collapse. Families began to vanish. Some fled into the woods, hoping to reach Lancaster or Harrisburg. Most were caught before they got far. The doctor had anticipated rebellion. He had hired men from Philadelphia, brutal enforcers who called themselves assistants, but whose work required only fists and guns. When the Yoders tried to escape, they were found near the railroad tracks and dragged back, beaten and bleeding. After that, no one dared attempt it openly. Others chose their own escape. Mary Stoltzfus, who had realized she had married her brother and borne 3 deformed children, filled her dress pockets with stones and walked into Connoy Creek. Her body was found downstream days later, the water around her hair tangled with wildflowers. The doctor listed her death as accidental drowning. Her husband stopped speaking altogether, sitting by the window until his eyes turned to glass. Even the animals seemed to sense something rotting in the valley. Dogs whined at night, cattle refused to drink from the spring. The sulfur smell that once was faint grew stronger, clinging to the air like decay, and the doctor changed. Where once he had preached with passion, he now ranted with fever. His Tuesday lectures turned to tirades about purity and the sacrifice required for progress. He no longer spoke of healing, but of cleansing, of remaking the human race in perfect form. He began writing letters to other physicians, men in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, encouraging them to establish their own colonies of optimized heredity. Charlotte knew time was running out. She gathered the documents she had copied, birth records, receipts for purchased children, coded ledgers, and sent a letter to Frederick Schaefer, a journalist in Lancaster known for investigating medical fraud. She begged him to meet her at a tavern 10 miles from the settlement. She planned to hand over everything, but she never arrived. 2 days later, her body was found in a ravine at the edge of the woods. Her neck was broken, her face turned toward the sky as if she'd died mid-prayer. Engelhardt declared it a tragic fall. The papers she had carried were gone. Frederick Schaefer, however, had already received one envelope by post, a packet of notes and fragments that hinted at horrors beyond imagining. It was enough to start an inquiry, but not enough to prove anything. And without proof, no one dared challenge the doctor who was known in Philadelphia's elite circles as a pioneer of medical reform. Still, Schaefer began watching. Months passed. The year turned to 1870, and the once orderly settlement had become a place of shadows. The houses stood weathered and grey, the fields half-tended, the children sickly. The doctor's men patrolled the roads, and the sound of crying drifted nightly through open windows. Daniel and Rebecca, the two orphans marked as paired, had grown into adolescence. Daniel was 15 now, Rebecca 13. Despite Englehart's rules, they found ways to meet. In the old barn at the edge of the fields, they whispered to each other, sharing fragments of memory. A house with blue shutters, a mother who sang in German, the smell of bread baking on Sundays. Slowly the truth formed between them. They were brother and sister. When they realized it, something in Daniel broke. He told Rebecca that the doctor had chosen them, had written letters about them. They were meant to be the next series. He wanted them to marry, to continue the pure line. Rebecca wanted to flee, but there was nowhere left to run. The valley had become a cage. That winter, Englehart's mind slipped fully into mania. His lectures became sermons of purification. He spoke of building new settlements, of spreading his design across the nation, of creating a generation born free of hereditary impurity. The families listened in silence, terrified yet too broken to rise, but someone else was already coming for him. In early April of 1871, a woman arrived in Lancaster. She was 53, her face worn by decades of factory labor, her hair streaked with grey. She introduced herself as Elizabeth Morrison, claiming to be a relative of the Brennan family, searching for a lost inheritance. She took a room at the White Swan Inn, the same inn where Englehart had stayed 15 years earlier. But her name was a lie. She was Mary Elizabeth Brennan, the mother of the twins who had been stolen from her 30 years before. She had spent her life searching. The story she'd been told in 1841 was that her children had died of cholera while she worked at the mill. She'd been shown sealed coffins, forged certificates, and a doctor's signature, Cornelius Englehart. Something in her heart had never believed it. Over the decades, she had saved every penny she could, learned to read, studied legal papers, tracked the doctor through every article and publication he ever released. She had followed rumors of a settlement hidden in the Pennsylvania hills, a place where the afflicted were said to be healed by revolutionary methods. Now she had found it. She went first to the courthouse, reading property deeds in silence. Then to the merchants who supplied the settlement, asking careful questions. Every answer confirmed her fear. On April 15, 1871, she stood at the gates of Harmonia Springs. Her forged papers declared her a relative, seeking William Brennan's signature on an inheritance claim. The doctor, suspicious but eager for outside funds, permitted her entry under supervision. The first time she saw William, he was bent over a workbench, sawdust clinging to his sleeves. She recognized him before he looked up. The way his shoulders curved, the line of his jaw, the small scar above his right eye that matched her own father's. When he turned, she nearly collapsed. She was looking at her son. She held herself steady, spoke calmly, played her role. The doctor's assistant, a brute named Roth, stood beside her, watching every move. She asked polite questions, feigned ignorance, but her eyes kept drifting toward the house on the eastern edge of the settlement, where a woman stood in the doorway. Her belly swollen, her face haunted. That night, when the guards grew lazy, Elizabeth crept from her quarters and crossed the moonlit fields. The house smelled faintly of sulfur and roses. Sarah opened the door in her nightdress, startled by the stranger's urgency. Elizabeth stepped inside, trembling. The candlelight revealed two faces, one aged by time, one young but identical in the eyes. She told her everything, how she had been 23, a widow with infant twins, working 16-hour shifts in a textile mill. How a man claiming to represent a charitable orphanage had promised a better life for her children. How she had signed papers she couldn't read, believing she'd see them again. When she returned 2 weeks later, the office was empty, and no one would tell her where they'd gone. She opened a locket, its brass dull with age. Inside were 2 painted infants, one fair, one dark, both with the same grey-green eyes that now stared back at her from Sarah's face. "My babies," she whispered. "My beautiful babies," Sarah's cry shattered the silence. William, hearing it from the workshop, ran inside. When his eyes met Elizabeth's, something deep within him recognized her instantly. The 3 clung together, mother and children reunited not in joy but in horror, knowing what had been done to them. But their reunion was seen. Daniel, wandering the night to meet Rebecca, glimpsed them through the window, the stranger, the embrace, the candlelight. Not understanding, he told the only adult he trusted, old Heinrich Weaver. Within an hour, the news spread like fire. Families stepped into the streets despite curfew. Voices rose from whispers to cries. Someone rang the bell in the meeting hall, the sound that had once called them to worship, now summoning them to judgment. Engelhardt emerged from the medical facility, his face pale and drawn, a pistol in one hand and a bottle in the other. His 3 remaining assistants followed, armed and shaking. He commanded them to return to their homes, shouting that the assembly was illegal. That proximity spread hereditary contamination. But Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. She demanded he tell them the truth. Tell them what he had done, how he had made brothers marry sisters, how he had filled the hillside with their children's graves. The crowd's murmurs grew to a roar. Stones flew, shattering windows. Someone shouted about the stolen infants, another about the orphans bought like cattle. Engelhardt's hand trembled on the pistol. He called them ignorant, claimed their suffering was holy, a sacrifice for the perfection of mankind. "In 100 years, he hissed, my work will be vindicated." He raised the gun toward Elizabeth. William moved before thought, knocking her aside as the shot cracked through the night. The bullet tore through his shoulder. Sarah screamed and caught him as he fell, blood spreading across her dress. The sight of blood broke the crowd's restraint. They surged forward, overtaking the doctor's men in seconds. Engelhardt fled into the medical facility, slamming the doors behind him. But the people of Harmonia Springs were done obeying. Axes splintered the wood, and they poured inside. What they found would haunt them forever. The laboratory was filled with jars, hundreds of them, each containing small bodies suspended in cloudy liquid. The remains of children, labeled with numbers instead of names. Charts covered the walls, mapping marriages and births like breeding stock. On a table lay a child's skull split neatly in 2, the bone tagged with a copper plate. Engelhardt stood at the far end of the room, surrounded by his life's work. He smiled a terrible smile. Then came the explosion. The explosion tore through the valley like thunder-made flesh. Windows shattered as a column of fire rose from the heart of Harmonia Springs, bright enough to turn midnight into day. The ground shook, and the air filled with the sickening scent of burning chemicals. The medical facility, that towering monument to progress, erupted in a bloom of orange and white. People ran screaming from their houses as debris rained down, embers glowing against the black sky. The force threw William and Sarah to the ground. When she looked up, the building where her children had been born, where their bodies had been taken after death, was a mountain of flame. Inside, Cornelius Engelhardt had already sealed his fate. He had prepared for this moment, perhaps long before that night. Beneath the floors, he had stored canisters of ether and chloroform, unstable gases that, when combined and ignited, would erase everything. Whether he meant to destroy only the evidence or himself along with it, no one would ever know. The fire devoured the facility within minutes. The roof collapsed with a shriek of metal, sending a gust of heat that seared the nearby fields. The trees along the creek caught next, their branches burning like torches reflected in the water. The sky glowed red until dawn. When the flames finally died 2 days later, the valley was a wasteland. Charred beams jutted from smoldering ruins. The acrid smell of chemicals clung to everything. Mingling with the sweetness of decay among the ashes, Searchers found what was left of Engelhardt, unrecognizable except for the melted frame of his spectacles and the twisted remains of his pocket watch. His assistants lay nearby, their bodies burned almost to dust. The people of Harmonia Springs stood in silence, the enormity of what they'd done and what had been done to them settling like ash on their skin. There was no triumph, only emptiness. Sarah moved among the survivors with a hollow calm. She helped carry water, tended burns, and comforted mothers whose children were gone. Her dress was still stained with William's blood, but she refused to change it. Elizabeth, her newly found mother, stayed close, her weathered hands steady even as her heart broke anew for the twins she had lost to the doctor's cruelty. When the county officials arrived on April 18th, they found a settlement half destroyed, its people starving and dazed. The investigators rode in expecting a fire report. What they found instead was evidence of a nightmare. Inside the ruins of the medical facility, they uncovered fragments of ledgers, charred charts, and glass jars half melted but still revealing their contents. Deformed skulls, preserved limbs, the remains of infants labeled by code. Some documents had survived in Engelhardt's office, protected by heavy drawers. Among them was a collection of genealogical charts that mapped out the settlement's population like livestock breeding records. Every marriage, every birth, every death, arranged according to traits, measurements, and hereditary calculations. Next to each name was a numerical code and often a note. Viable, weak expression, terminated specimen. Judge Harrison Fulton of the Lancaster County Court was summoned to oversee the inquiry. He had presided over murder cases, fraud and corruption, but nothing prepared him for the files spread before him. The evidence suggested that at least 40 families had been manipulated over 15 years. Children had been taken, bought or bred under false pretenses. Brothers and sisters had been married without their knowledge. Dozens of infants had died in the name of hereditary science. In his report to Harrisburg, Fulton described what he found as a system of calculated abomination so refined that it transcends mere crime. The depositions from survivors were painful to read. Mothers spoke of their children's deformities, their confusion, the doctor's insistence that their suffering was progress. Fathers admitted to following orders they didn't understand because the doctor promised healing. Each testimony added a new layer of horror. William Brennan survived the gunshot wound, though his arm never fully healed. When officials questioned him, he sat silent for hours before speaking. His voice was hollow, as if each word cost him something he could never regain. He told them about the marriage, the children, the discovery that he and Sarah were twins. When the judge asked if he hated the doctor, William stared at the floor and said he didn't know if hatred was strong enough a word. Sarah was questioned too. She described the births, the treatments, the nightmares, and the night she learned the truth. She told them about Charlotte Pennypacker's warning, about her courage, about how she died trying to expose the evil that consumed them all. Her voice never broke until she spoke of her children. Then she wept in a way that silenced everyone in the room. The investigation revealed that Engelhardt had not acted alone. Hidden in his correspondence were letters from wealthy patrons, prominent businessmen, politicians, and academics from Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. They had funded his work, describing it as the foundation of a purified American race. One letter bore the seal of a Pennsylvania state senator. The revelation threatened to ignite a scandal that could have reached the highest levels of government. Within weeks, the documents began to disappear. Files vanished from the courthouse. Witnesses were pressured into silence. 3 separate congressional inquiries were launched, and each was abruptly closed before reaching a conclusion. Judge Fulton, furious, wrote in his private notes that forces beyond law and decency have chosen to bury the truth for the sake of propriety. His report was sealed, labeled restricted, national security. By the end of 1871, Harmonia Springs was abandoned. The family scattered, most taking new names and vanishing into anonymity. The Weavers fled to Canada. The Yoders joined relatives in Wisconsin. The Zimmermans disappeared somewhere in Illinois. The valley was left to the crows and the creeping forest. Sarah and William faced a decision no words could soften. They were bound as husband and wife in the eyes of the world, but now they knew what lay beneath that bond. They had 3 surviving children, each bearing the unmistakable marks of the doctor's experiment. In September, under the grey light of autumn, they stood together one last time beside the creek where they had once dreamed of a future. The air smelled of wet earth and sulphur. William's arm hung useless at his side, his face drawn with pain. They agreed to separate. She would take the children and move east with Elizabeth, who had contacts in Baltimore's textile industry. William would travel west under an assumed name, starting again as a carpenter in Ohio. There was no ceremony, no final embrace, only exhaustion. Before leaving, Sarah walked to the hillside cemetery. The markers were already beginning to rot, the names fading from the weathered wood. She placed wildflowers on the graves and whispered an apology to each small mound. Then she turned and walked away without looking back. The world beyond the valley barely noticed when Harmonia Springs ceased to exist. Newspapers mentioned a fire, a few vague reports of medical irregularities, then moved on to other scandals. The Civil War had left the nation numb to tragedy. One more lost settlement in rural Pennsylvania was hardly worth ink, but the families who survived carried the weight of it like a curse. In Baltimore, Sarah told people she was a war widow. The deformities of her children were blamed on hardship and malnutrition. She found work sewing in a textile factory while Elizabeth watched the little ones. William wrote once from Ohio, a letter so brief it might have been written by a ghost. Their eldest, Thomas, never recovered from the physical damage of his birth. His lungs were weak, his bones brittle. In 1874, at 15, he died quietly in his sleep. Sarah buried him under the name Thomas Graber, using her maiden name to hide the truth. His headstone was small and simple, just a name, 2 dates, and nothing more. Elizabeth stood beside her daughter at the grave, her eyes dim but her back straight. She told Sarah that someday the truth must be known, that silence was another kind of crime. She made her promise to write everything down, to document the horror so it could never happen again. Sarah kept that promise. In 1878, Elizabeth died peacefully, her hands clasped around the locket that still held the painted faces of her lost twins. Sarah, now in her late 30s, gathered her memories into a single journal, page after page of names, dates, and nightmares. She wrote of the valley, the doctor, the births, the fire, and the secret graves. She ended it with 5 words: "We were brother and sister." She placed the journal in a safety deposit box with instructions that it not be opened for 50 years. When it finally was, in 1921, the world had changed beyond recognition. New doctors spoke openly of eugenics as the science of the future. Politicians praised it as progress. Sarah's account was dismissed as the delusion of a traumatized woman. The physical evidence, what little remained, had long been destroyed or sealed away. Still, her words survived, haunting the few who read them. And though Harmonia Springs was gone, its shadow remained. The valley grew wild again. Trees reclaimed the roads. The creek ran clear for the first time in decades. Travelers passing through sometimes spoke of strange shapes among the ruins, of children's laughter echoing where no children lived. Locals avoided the area after dusk, saying the ground itself whispered. But the truth needed no ghosts to remain terrible. Harmonia Springs had not been destroyed by the supernatural, nor cursed by God. Its evil had been entirely human, born of ambition, arrogance, and the belief that suffering could be justified in the name of perfection. The state eventually placed the site under restricted ownership. The surviving documents, Sarah's journal, fragments of Englehart's research, and court transcripts were sealed in the National Archives, labeled classified until 2071. The official explanation called the matter a sensitive historical case involving early medical experimentation. Unofficially, those who had read the files called it something else, a wound in the nation's soul. By the end of that century, no one alive remembered the name Harmonia Springs. But history has a way of surfacing what the powerful try to bury, and one day, the earth itself would give up its dead. Time passed, but the earth remembered. By the dawn of the 20th century, Harmonia Springs was little more than a name on old deeds and whispered legend. The valley had grown wild again. Vines strangled the ruins of the brick foundations, and trees rooted through the floors of what had once been homes. The sulfur spring still bubbled up through limestone, its water clear, yet carrying the faint, metallic scent of something long decayed. Hikers who stumbled across the place sometimes spoke of odd sensations, of dizziness, of hearing faint cries in the wind, of the uncanny feeling of being watched. But to the rest of the world, the settlement was forgotten. Only a few historians knew its story, pieced together from half-burned records and one woman's journal. Sarah Brennan lived out her years quietly in Baltimore. She never remarried. The younger children she bore, those who survived the experiments, grew into adulthood but remained fragile, plagued by illnesses no doctor could explain. None had children of their own. By the time Sarah died, sometime in the 1890s, her bloodline had all but vanished. Yet her words endured. When her safety deposit box was opened in 1921, the journal inside drew immediate attention from the archivists who catalogued it. It told a story so grotesque, so methodically cruel, that they refused to release it publicly. The official reason was respect for the dead. The truth was fear that people might recognize their own country in its pages. By then, the language of eugenics had become fashionable again. Politicians and professors spoke of improving society through selective breeding, of sterilizing the unfit, of protecting the purity of the national bloodline. The same ideas that had birthed Harmonia Springs now wore the mask of science. Sarah's account was quietly dismissed as hysteria, and her name faded back into the shadows. The file was labeled confidential, psychological study of early rural experimentation. It was shelved in the National Archives beside reports of asylum reforms and cholera outbreaks, the monstrous hidden among the mundane. It would take another war and another generation of atrocities for the world to understand that her story had not been madness, but prophecy. After the revelations of the Nazi eugenics programs in the 1940s, a few scholars revisited old American experiments that seemed disturbingly familiar. Among them was the case of Harmonia Springs. They found Judge Fulton's sealed report, fragments of Engelhardt's research, and faded photographs of the valley before the fire. One image showed a group of children standing in front of the meeting hall. Their expressions were blank, their bodies distorted by unseen hands of fate. Some had twisted limbs, others oversized heads or fused fingers. On the back of the photograph, written in an elegant hand, were the words, Series 3, progressing favorably. No one knows who wrote it. The last person with first-hand memory of the settlement was Margaret Yoder, born Margaret Stoltz, who had been a small child when the fire consumed the facility. She spent her adult life in a convent in Maryland, having taken religious vows of silence. But in 1943, near the end of her life, she broke that silence. On her deathbed, she confided her memories to a young nun who wrote them down and hid the account in the convent's archives. Her story confirmed Sarah Brennan's journal in every terrible detail and added new ones. She remembered being taken through the laboratory as a child, shown jars of preserved fetuses by the doctor himself, his voice calm and clinical as he described each deformity as a necessary failure. She remembered visitors, men in fine coats, watching quietly, asking questions, taking notes. They spoke of other settlements, other doctors, other projects. According to Margaret, Harmonia Springs had not been alone. There were similar experiments in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, places where poverty and isolation offered easy subjects and few questions. Engelhardt had corresponded with them all, comparing results, discussing what he called successes in controlled hereditary refinement. Margaret also claimed that some of the families who escaped Harmonia Springs were later hunted down. She remembered overhearing Engelhardt's assistants talking about containment. A few months before the fire, letters arrived from Philadelphia with lists of names and the words compromise risk. The Zimmerman family, who had fled to Illinois, were found dead in 1873. Father, mother and children all poisoned. The local papers called it a murder-suicide, but Margaret remembered overhearing the doctor say, "The contamination must not spread." How much of her story was truth, and how much was the fevered memory of a dying woman, no one can say. But the pieces fit too perfectly to ignore. When researchers uncovered her confession in the 1960s, they petitioned for the National Archives to release the Harmonia Springs files. The request was denied. The official reason was national security concerns. The files were reclassified and sealed again, this time with a new label, restricted until 2071. Perhaps the state feared what would be revealed. Perhaps it feared what it already knew, that Engelhardt's experiment had been funded, not by one deranged man, but by a network of respected scientists and politicians who saw him as a pioneer. History is often written by those with the most to lose, and so the valley slept beneath the trees, its story sinking into silence. Then, in the spring of 1995, construction crews began cutting through the old Lancaster Hills to lay the foundation for a new highway. One morning, as bulldozers tore into a rise overlooking the creek, the ground gave way to a pit lined with weathered boards. Inside were bones, small bones, too small to be anything but children. 17 sets in total. The remains were deformed, their skulls elongated, ribs warped, fingers fused together in ways that defied normal growth. Forensic analysis confirmed they had been buried more than a century earlier. DNA testing linked them to one another. They were all related, siblings or cousins, products of a closed, interbred population. The site matched the old records of Harmonia Springs. For a few weeks, local newspapers reported the discovery as a 19th century child cemetery. The details were vague, the tone almost apologetic. Then the article stopped. The bones were quietly reinterred in an unmarked grave at an undisclosed location. The state issued a brief statement attributing the site to early medical research. But someone leaked a photograph to a journalist. It showed the excavation at dusk, the skeletons laid side by side. The skulls appeared stretched, alien, almost luminous under the floodlights. The caption beneath it read, "The Children of Harmonia Springs." The image circulated briefly before disappearing from official records. The journalist who published it later claimed his notes had been stolen and his editor pressured to drop the story. He moved out of state and refused to speak about it again. That might have been the end of it. But history has a way of echoing forward. In 2003, after the death of a prominent Philadelphia family descended from one of Engelhardt's original investors, a collection of personal papers was found in their estate. Among them was a letter dated March 1871, just weeks before the fire. It was signed by C. Engelhardt. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. "My work here nears completion. The subjects have performed beyond expectation. The seed has been planted. Others will continue what I have begun. The purification of the American bloodline is too important to be hindered by ignorance or sentimentality. In time, the world will understand. What I have built is not an ending, but a beginning." It ended with a single initial. E. No one could prove whether the others he mentioned truly existed. But scholars have since uncovered troubling patterns. Unexplained medical colonies in the Midwest, sterilization campaigns in the early 20th century, the persistence of his theories in academic papers decades after his death. Engelhardt may have perished in his laboratory, but his ideas did not. They spread quietly through institutions, wearing the language of progress. The valley itself remains sealed off, officially designated as private conservation land. Maps show it as uninhabited forest. The sulfur spring still runs, its surface glimmering like old glass. Locals say that when the wind is right, you can hear faint cries near the water, like the echo of children calling from beneath the earth. No one drinks from it anymore. Today, 3 boxes in the National Archives contain what remains of the case. One holds fragments of Engelhardt's charred ledgers. Another holds Sarah Brennan's journal and the birth certificates she kept. The third contains photographs so disturbing that they were locked away decades ago. Images of the children born from those incestuous unions, labeled with code numbers instead of names. Each box bears a label, restricted until 2071. A national security, no one knows what will happen. When that seal is lifted, some historians believe the full truth will finally emerge, that we will learn the names of the men who funded the project, that the descendants of those families may still live, unaware of their origin. Others fear that revealing it would only prove how easily humanity forgets its own atrocities, repeating them under new banners and cleaner language. Because what makes Harmonia Springs truly terrifying isn't just that it happened, but that it was never truly unique. The same reasoning, the same hunger for purity has appeared again and again across the centuries, dressed each time in the robes of science, faith, or progress. The graves in that valley remind us what happens when compassion bends to arrogance, when the powerless become subjects, and when those who call themselves healers decide who deserves to live. The spring still flows. The forest has reclaimed the houses. The wind carries no answers, only the murmur of water over stone, and the rustle of leaves over ground that once held children's bones. Perhaps it is mercy that no one lives there now, because some places are not haunted by the dead, but by the memories of what humans once believed they had the right to do. And if you ever find yourself wandering in the woods of Lancaster County, and you come upon a trickle of water that smells faintly of sulfur, don't drink from it. Don't linger. Listen closely, though. You might hear the faint sound of a lullaby carried on the wind, sung in a language long forgotten. A mother's song for children who never should have been born. This has been Liturgy of Dread, where history's most terrible secrets are not myths or monsters, just people, with power and the conviction that they were right. Until next time, remember, some valleys were never meant to be remembered.